In college, I learned about liberation theology, feminist theology, and black liberation theology. So kind of emerged by that name in the 1960s, but really it was in the tradition of people like Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and a man named David Walker. So I didn't read David Walker until seminary, but he was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. His father was a slave, but his mother was a free black woman. And so by law, I think he was born free. But of course, being born in the South, that was a troubling time. He moved north, became part of the abolitionist movement. There was kind of a black newspaper in New York, and he headed the Boston division. And so he was literate. He wrote a book called David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, but especially to those in the United States. And basically what he does is outline the oppression of people of color, slave and free, both in terms of their education or lack thereof, their economic exploitation, obviously, under slavery, religious oppression under a certain form of white Christianity, and then also the colonialization of Liberia and the attempts to get blacks, especially free blacks, to move to Africa and just become Liberians. And so he was resisting on all these fronts and pointing out problems on all these fronts. And I just love this because he was talking about how, slaves, of course, would not be taught how to read or write. Especially they would not be taught geography, because then they would learn how to read a map and then they would learn how to escape. As a problem today, right? If you keep people in a slave class, in a working class, minimally educated, then they don't seek to rise above that economic level. And so you keep them permanently in a class where you can exploit their labor, right? So that I could be a CEO of a company if people paid the minimum wage, and I can make tons of money off of their labor, not have to pay them that much because they don't have as good enough education to get a better job. So it's in my interest, if I'm an exploitative capitalist, to keep them pretty poorly educated, just educated enough to do the job that I want them to do, but not educated enough to go any farther. Giving people enough to survive and to reproduce, but not enough to be able to buy their freedom or thrive. We essentially do that today, right? We give people enough to survive, to reproduce, so they can continue being, reproducing a working class caste system. And then he does a critique of the Christianity that has supported slavery, a critique of slave owners who claim to be Christians. This is an abomination to Christianity, as it was. And then he critiques these whites and blacks who are promoting blacks moving to Liberia, this sort of back to Africa movement, and says, that's preposterous. We built this country with our blood, sweat, and tears. We're more American than anybody else. And so the wealth of this country has been produced by slave labor. So we're not going anywhere. What he predicts is that God will end slavery in the United States in one way or the other. And essentially predicts that, if the people don't do it peacefully, it will happen violently, even if not at the hands of slaves themselves. So what he's essentially saying is that black people there's not going to be an uprising because black people are Christians. And they're not going to kill their slave masters. They're going to escape, right? And so the model, of course, is Moses and the Hebrew slaves escaping Egypt. Instead of rising up and killing the oppressors, they escape. They think that's the moral option. And yet, God destroys Pharaoh and Pharaoh's army. And so what David is essentially doing is predicting the Civil War as God's way of ending slavery, as God's punishment upon the United States for the sin of slavery. That's essentially what I believe. So I find it remarkable that he's able to essentially predict that about 30 years ahead of time. He was a prophet, the first black liberationist theologian, at least who published something that became so widespread. he was a Methodist, and he was a Methodist. So he participated in Methodism both in North Carolina, as far as I know, and definitely among abolitionist Methodists in the North. A really cool black Methodist doing liberationist work. David Walker really inspired me a lot because of, in his short little pamphlet, he just critiqued things that are valid critiques today. So the ways in which we use education, economic exploitation, religion, and colonialism to perpetuate a form of racist capitalism. It's great. It's a great critique. It's short. It's exciting. He's very passionate, and he just does a great job of critiquing like Thomas Jefferson and Bartolomé de las Casas, who's renowned for defending the rights of Native Americans, but then saying, oh, don't kill these Native Americans, enslave black people instead. So he's just an exciting figure, and he died in his 30s. So we don't know a lot about him. So we kind of just have that little book, and I highly recommend it.